Hello, everyone, and welcome to PMTA's very first webinar. I am very excited to introduce Mr. Douglas Marcello, a member of our board of directors here at PMTA and a great friend to the association. My name is Brandon Marie. I'm the director of member communications for PMTA. Like I said, this is our very first webinar. We're looking forward to using this technology more and more in the coming months, given the changes that we've all had to deal with the COVID-19 situation. So we're excited that each of you could be with us. And at this point in time, I will turn things over to Mr. Marcello. Doug, you can take it away.
Thank you, Brandon. You know, you don't need to be told the last 90 days have been like anything that we have ever experienced in our lifetime. Shutdowns based upon quarantines in our major cities coming to a halt, new habits when we go to shop or other activities to protect ourselves, but more importantly, protect others. But while many things have shut down, many things have stopped, one of the things that has been reliable, dependent, and vital has been our industry, the trucking industry. We have shown what we have known all along, but many people now come to appreciate that we are the lifeblood of America. What we do delivers what is needed, be it food, support, supplies, medicine, etc. And while we kept working that entire time, the FMCSA came and continued to work as well. And during this time, during even the period of emergency exemptions, they announced changes in the regulations. You know, we come and found that the primary one is the hours of service change that has occurred in this. That's what we're going to talk about today. And what I thought I would do is to go through what are the changes, how does it impact you, what's the rationale, why did the FMCSA do or make the changes in the manner that they did. Keep in mind that I am telling you what they said and did, not my opinion on that. And what are the keys to you as a company, as a driver, in order to deal with this? Sound fair? By the nodding of heads, I can tell that we have unanimous agreement on that, something very rare in today's world. Well, the FMCSA has announced changes to the hours of service regulations that impact the driving time available. And there are four main areas that they did this: the short haul exception, the 30-minute rest break, the adverse driving conditions exception, and with regard to the sleeper berth. Now, the changes make these four areas primarily consistent with other regulations and time periods. They clarify some issues, but they also make modifications based upon studies that have been performed since the original enactment or since the last change in these statuses. So what's changed? Well, let's talk first about what hasn't changed. What has not changed in the FMCSA in promulgating these is quick to point out that there's still 11-hour limit on driving time, a 14-hour limit on the driving window, 10 hours off duty required, and the maximum 60, 70-hour accumulated on duty time is still in effect on that. In addition, they say, look, we may have changed some of the allowances on this, but again, what has not changed is the prohibition against driving while ill or fatigued, and also the prohibition against coercion to violate these safety rules. Those are what has not changed in this. So we got changes. When do they come into effect? The effective date of these is 120 days after it's published in the Federal Register. And if you're like me, you're going, wait a minute, why the delay in this? And the reason noted by the FMCSA is, and we should keep this in mind going in the future, they need to give times to the vendors and manufacturers of the ELDs to reprogram them, to be able to put into their programs the changes that are made so that the ELDs will be up to date. Now, when I got into the law, they promised me there was no math involved. So bear with me on this. The effective date, it's published on June 1st, 2020. If the limited math that I use is correct, the effective date is September 29th, 2020. So we still have some ways to go on this. You're still under the old rules. But until that time, let's look ahead in terms of what we're dealing with. There are four main areas. What's the first one? The short haul exception. And what they've done with the short haul exception is this. There are two primary changes. First, they extended the distance from 100 air miles to 150 air miles. And second, they've increased the driving window from 12 to 14 hours, the work shift time period on this. Now, the first of these, the distance change. They've extended it from 100 air miles to 150 air miles. Air miles, for quick refresher course to you, an air mile equals 6,076 feet. There are 100 air miles would equal 115.08 miles. And we're talking about 150 air mile radius. That extends that radius out to 172.6 miles. That's the radius. That's from the middle out, limited math. What does that mean? Well, this diagram shows two things. Number one, when you extend out to 150 air miles, you can cover a significant area with that. And number two, it shows, considering what all can be covered, that Carlisle, as I've always said, is the center of the universe. But let's move forward. The impact on this, well, first of all, the territory now that can be covered by a short haul driver is 70,650 square miles. And again, if you want to check my math, let me show you my computations. I read it out of the FMCSA provisions on that. But the key thing is this: the rationale for increasing the distance and the time is severalfold. Number one, the FMCSA goes, look, we've already given 3 exceptions to companies to bump up from 12 to 14-hour workdays. If we can do them for them, it's probably something we should do for other companies as well. Second, short haul companies have an option to use these on a limited basis within a time period, so that the current 12-hour time limit, returning to the same work location, they can already use a 14-hour window up to 8 days in a 30 consecutive day period without an ELD, so long as they use paper logs. Now, if we're going to have that provision, why don't we just make it to 14 hours? That also, the 14 hours makes it in line with what the long haul drivers have been able to use and have been using for a period of time. And additionally, they say, finally, the change brings the short haul drivers into line with the non-CDL drivers who have been able to use the 14-hour driving window in operations within 150 air miles of their normal work reporting location. These drivers also have the option to operate within a 16-hour window up to 2 days per week within the 150 air miles. Bottom line is this: look, other companies, other drivers have been able to do it. Let's bring the mileage, let's bring the hours up to where these other folks are for the short haul drivers. What has not changed for the short haul drivers, much like we talked at the beginning about what has not changed in general, still have the maximum 11-hour driving requirement, still require 10 hours off duty, and still require, and this is going to be important, spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about this as one of the impacts, but you still are required to keep the records as to when the driver reports to duty, when the driver's released to duty, and you must retain those for 6 months. And there's also the requirement to have the 7 or 8 prior days when somebody comes on to you. But the main ones are these: when the driver reports, when the driver released, and when those records must be retained for 6 months in order to comply with the short haul exception. And one of the other key things that hasn't changed, the driver has to report to and return to the same location. That is among the key aspects for what has not changed. What are the keys to this? What does it mean to you? Well, speaking about spoiler alert, for drivers and companies, the key is going to be accurate documentation and retention of those documents. The FMCSA notes that it can review carrier records to determine whether drivers have traveled to locations beyond that distance. In performing enforcement, the FMCSA says that personnel will focus on the time period from reporting to the work location to that being released from the work location, the maximum distance traveled from the normal work reporting location, and the time spent at the locations traveled. The FMCSA also noted that investigators could request documents reflecting that data. So while an audit may seem unlikely, there still remains that constant potential that your company and its drivers could come on the FMCSA radar. Well, why would that happen? Well, uh, as part of an investigation for an accident, or even the complaint of a disgruntled driver could readily put the spotlight on your company, your drivers, and make you have to dig for the documentation that would have to support and defend you having the short haul exception. The other thing in today's world is, of course, the potential exposure to lawsuits. This is, again, something that will be key and that you would need to justify, need to show that you have been entitled to the short haul exemption, because the repercussions of intentional or even unintended violations could result in not just a large verdict, a nuclear verdict they talk about nowadays, but even the potential for punitive damages. That's the key to the short haul exception. Two areas changed: extend it to 150 air miles, extend the workday to 14 hours. Both of these bring it into alignment with other things. Key thing: document, keep the documents, make sure you comply. The second area we're going to talk about is the 30-minute break. The first change is it provides that the required break can be satisfied by any non-driving period of 30 minutes. And additionally, now it kicks in, the requirement is it must occur within the first 8 hours of driving time, no longer the first 8 hours of on-duty time the way it used to be. Any non-driving status now can satisfy this. No longer is it only a off-duty non-driving requirement on this. So you can have off-duty non-driving, just like we have now, but you can use sleeper berth time or an on-duty not driving status, as well as a combination. So, for example, under the existing regulations, the break would require the driver to be off-duty doing no work, paperwork loading, unloading, or otherwise. And it was triggered after 8 hours, regardless of the driving time. This provides that you can use the time for loading, unloading, other aspects, paperwork, etc. The normal course to try to incorporate what duties you have into break time on these situations. The rationale: did I say at the beginning that this is what the FMCSA says? It's not Doug talking? All right. Why keep the break in the first place? Why not get rid of it? The FMCSA has granted a number of exemptions of the 30-minute break. The CVSA, law enforcement, has questioned why retain it, because there are so many exemptions and enforcement is difficult. So why is it still required? Well, the rationale, FMCSA talking here, is the reason there's still a break is because, quote, it has been demonstrated in multiple research efforts that time on task is a leading contributor to driver fatigue, unquote. And it relies on a study that any type of break is beneficial to the driver, whether or not it's consisted of work activities or rest. It is the key to them is, quote, time off task, period, to stop driving, get off of the driving task for 30 minutes to refresh. The FMCSA noted that one of the commentators who responded when they proposed this quoted a member of their organization and said, gee, 99.9% of our drivers take a 30-minute break in an 8-hour period otherwise. The FMCSA seized upon that and said, great. Then in that case, the break's not going to be disruptive. In other words, the FMCSA is going, if you're telling us you do it anyhow, what's the big deal? Sometimes it's best for folks not to speak up. But the key thing here is that we're looking at, it affords any non-driving period of 30 minutes as qualifying as a break. Use it, incorporate it into your schedule. Look and make sure your drivers know that loading, unloading time, fueling, paperwork, etc., can qualify for that break within the 8 hours of driving. Additionally, if a driver has multiple duties, such as loading, unloading, and driving, to the extent that you can organize the non-driving duties first, front load it, such as a delivery person loading their truck first. This extends the time needed for the break to later in the day. Remember, it no longer goes off of on duty, it goes off of driving time. Use the change not requiring to break up the 8-hour driving in the day. That's the break, 30-minute break requirement, the changes that are made to there. The next one is the adverse driving conditions. There have been changes to the adverse driving conditions provisions as well. Let's take a look at those. The changes are made that a driver who encounters adverse driving conditions is allowed now up to 16-hour driving window in order for property carriers within which to complete the 13 hours of driving. The problem before was you got 2 additional hours of driving time, but you still had to do it within the 14 hours. Now that's been extended up to the 16 hours. The definition of adverse driving conditions is modified so the exception can be applied based on the driver's, not just the dispatcher's or the carrier's knowledge of the condition after being dispatched. Additionally, clarifying changes were made to include the word immediately in terms of when, in relation to the driver going on duty, must there be no knowledge of the situation, as well as to make sure and to clarify the reference to unusual road and traffic conditions. The prior joinder was and, they now modified it to read unusual road or traffic conditions, clarifying that either scenario would qualify. Well, under the resulting wording, the key is to look at how it applies and what are the situations. We go back to the definition of adverse driving condition as we go by and look at the groupings of them. With regard to weather, it means snow, ice, sleet, fog, or other adverse weather conditions. And it can be unusual road or traffic conditions, unusual road or unusual traffic conditions. The key is that these conditions, be it weather or road or traffic, were not known or could not reasonably be known. For example, if this is something that you or your driver could have picked up off of a weather app or picked up off of one of the, I believe it's the 511 Pennsylvania or other road aspects, construction area type of things, it's not going to meet the deal. It's a situation that was not known or could not reasonably have been known to a driver immediately prior to beginning the duty day. Keys to factors: not known, couldn't be known to a driver immediately prior to beginning the duty day, or immediately before beginning driving after qualifying rest break or sleeper berth period. Additionally, it's not just the driver's knowledge, but if it's not known also or could not reasonably known to a motor carrier immediately prior to dispatching the driver. Rationale, again, FMCSA talking here, that by extending the driving window to 16 hours due to adverse driving conditions, drivers no longer need to stay on the road during the adverse conditions to avoid being shut down by the 14-hour limit. They could run up to 13 with this exception, but they were still looking at a 14-hour wall at the end of the day. The revised rule coordinates the extension of driving window by up to 2 hours, consistent with the current regulations extension of up to 2 hours of driving time. The result? Well, the change would allow, if not incentivize, a slower driving or for drivers to take a break from the condition, as they'll now have 2 additional hours during which to complete their trip or reach a safe location. The extension is also in response to the unexpected realities of the road, despite the advantages of technology for projecting weather. The FMCSA said that it, quote, agrees that radar and technology may not be entirely accurate, and thus leaves the driver/dispatcher's discretion in this final rule. Finally, this is seen by the agency as being a rare exception. The FMCSA states that surveys of two major trade organizations indicate that the adverse driving condition exception is not frequently used. The message I got from reading the comments and the commentary by the FMCSA in issuing this rule, they're not looking for it to be used a lot. The rare exception. The keys that we're going to look at, the application is the rare exception, a unique adverse situation that was not and could not have been known immediately prior to the time the driver was dispatched or left on their route. The exception applies to situations outside the driver or carrier's control, knowledge, or ability to have knowledge. It's not expected to be frequently used. This is not a get more hours card. According to the FMCSA said that ultimately each adverse driving condition will create a unique set of unpredictable circumstances that drivers and motor carriers will react to, not plan for, period, end quote. The key here is adverse driving conditions are going to have to be unique, unanticipated, uncontrollable, unusual, something that's not known about prior to. What doesn't meet the definition? Detention time, breakdowns, enforcement inspections. The view is that these are not uncommon in the industry. They happen. You might not know when they're going to happen, but there is at least a level of frequency there. Similarly, the adverse driving conditions, while it talks about unusual road or traffic conditions, it does not cover road construction or detours. Quote, except when they could not reasonably be known before the driver started driving, comma, such as accidents that significantly interfere with traffic movement, unquote. So for example, if it looks like there's no construction, no bad weather, all seems clear, no reason to think otherwise, and there is a horrendous accident closing an interstate, that would seem to give rise to an exception here. Accordingly, the reverse, it wouldn't apply to a road condition that could reasonably be aware of. Something that you know or could anticipate, such as going up to State College on 8 autumn Saturday mornings in the fall, or just about any time of year for Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, on interstate highways or off of interstate highways any time of year in Lancaster County. Photo also reminds us what happens in life if we're not the lead horse, what our view is. Look, the enforcement in terms of the FMCSA, they say they don't envision enforcement problems. Drivers who do use the exception normally annotate it on their records of duty status. A law enforcement official could, as they do now, investigate whether this was a legitimate and supported use. Accordingly, if you're drivers or you are going to use the exception, document it. What was the condition? Why was it unanticipated? What was the action you took? Pulled over, detour, how does it make? As noted with the short haul exception, you got to be prepared to answer the information and the evidence at the event of a roadside that's going to check the hours of duty status, at a later audit, or after an accident. And with regard to an accident and the lawsuits that too often follow, it could well mean the difference between whether or not you're exposed to punitive damages for running over time. The key thing is work within the framework of the rule, document what it was, why it wasn't known ahead of time, what was encountered, what you did. Those are the key aspects of it. The last one is the sleeper berth. There are several changes to this. The first is to reduce the 7 hours in the sleeper berth from the 8-hour minimum of one of 2 sessions that's required now, and then provide that the second session in the sleeper berth must be, or at least it has to be combined with, let's put it this way, a minimum of 2 hours off duty, either inside or outside the sleeper berth, provided that the two periods total at least 10 hours. And then finally, that when paired together, the 7 hours and the other time, neither counts against the 14 hours. Now, it's noted that there was consideration for giving a 3-hour timeout on the hours of service as part of the proposed rules. That wasn't put in here. The alternative was that they took the second sleeper period up to 3 hours and said if that's paired with the 7 hours in the sleeper berth, that doesn't count against the 14 hours in that instance. Yeah, the rationale, the change to the 7 hours based on sleep studies that were made since the original imposition, adoption of the 8-hour rule. The FMCSA said, look, when we adopted the 8-hour sleeper berth period in 2005, there was no consensus as to the amount of sleep needed to maintain cognitive performance. How much does a driver need? So the FMCSA said that, well, we took the conservative approach and set the bar at 8 hours. Well, sleep studies after that rule indicate that the average sleep time for drivers is somewhere between 6.2 and 6.5 hours. Taking the average, say 6.2 hours. Well, you've got 6.2 hours of required sleep. All you're going to need to get that, the FMCSA figured, is that if you get into the sleeper berth, have 7 hours in the sleeper berth, that's more than enough time to get that average of 6.2 hours of sleep. Compare that to the current requirement of 8 hours. Now we've got 1.8, working on the math here, 1.8 hours beyond what the sleep time is. Not only is it well beyond what the 7 hours are, but you've got an amount of time and the driver now can't leave the sleeper berth until that 8-hour period is up. Well, you've taken it from being a place of necessary rest to, in effect, a penalty box. We don't have time today, but when you see me, remind me to tell you the story, Hershey Bears, Mike Nicoluk night, penalty box clearing event. It's worth it. All right, the second off-duty time, we talked about that. Again, up to 3 hours. Again, this is supported by the revision by another study that showed that individuals who slept 6.2 hours at night, if they combined that with a nap of 1.2 hours, they had lower levels of sleepiness and higher levels of performance compared to subjects who slept shorter periods without naps. Don't know that we set our alarm clocks on the 0.2 hours, but that's what they found. Thus, they revised it down to the 7 hours and then provided the off-duty time for the 3 hours, the second period, to not count against your clock. And some of the things that are interesting, the overall studies found that the split sleep schedules are feasible and can enhance flexibility of sleep work schedules, as well as participants with consolidated night sleeping or split sleeping, that if you had night sleeping or split sleeping, those people obtained more sleep time than those who got consolidated day sleeping. The result, if consolidated nighttime sleeping is not possible, split sleeping is preferable to a consolidated period of daytime sleeping. And the changes provide for the shorter period in the sleeper berth that it no longer counts against the 14 hours. The FMCSA stated that it believed that the exclusion of the shorter period will promote more effective rest, since drivers will no longer worry about the 14-hour clock ticking away potential revenues and miles while trying to rest. It believes that the revisions will result in increased ability for drivers to get a rest period when safe places to park are available. And as we all know, that's a big if. And also it enables drivers to schedule driving during non-peak hours and to have an increased ability to avoid conditions such as traffic, weather, and road closure. The 7-hour period provides a consolidated period of rest, sufficient to provide restorative sleep. The 3 hours gives time for a break. The keys, that time stops the clock. The longer time, which we call the anchor period, the 7 hours, is now shortened, while the FMCSA did not go along with the 3-hour pause on the 14-hour day. They provided that the shorter period in the sleeper berth will not count against the clock. Consider that and take that in flexibility. Overall, if you want more information, uh, look, I've done a video, hours of service changes in 3 minutes, to give a short course to drivers or to dispatchers or other people. If you're interested, it's on our webpage. You can download it off of the YouTube channel if you search by my name. There is a summary story blog that I do for trucknews.com. More's on there. And if you can't get any of that or find it, email me at the number below. We covered all this in half an hour. In the spirit of Billy Mays, but wait, there's more. A quick review, the crash preventability program has been adopted. The key facts there: must be an eligible accident that occurred on or after October 1st of 2019, and you submit it by data queue. We are in the bonus portion of today. You didn't even pay for this. And it must be submitted with a police report. That's potentially problematic. We'll talk in a few minutes. Why do it? It'll exclude the crash from your SMS, as well as it will be noted as non-preventable on the driver's PSP program. The eligible accidents are accidents in which the commercial motor vehicle is hit in the rear or the side in the rear, hit by a vehicle going the wrong way, or by a vehicle that was forced into the commercial vehicle while going the wrong way. When improper illegal turns are made, when the commercial motor vehicle is parked or legally stopped and is hit, is another potential for a non-preventable accident. When the other vehicle doesn't stop or slow as it's required to and strikes the commercial motor vehicle, the other driver is under the influence, or the commercial motor vehicle is hit as a result of being forced into it or caused by a driver under the influence. Medical emergency of the other. Somebody has a sudden heart attack, passes out, hits the commercial motor vehicle. That's one. That the other side has admitted inattentive, good luck with that. But if someone admits that they were on their phone or not paying attention, that will get it off your commercial driving record as well, or at least will be designated as non-preventable. Let's be more accurate on that. If your accident is caused by equipment or falling debris or a matter of infrastructure, that is something that we consider non-preventable. An animal strike doesn't mean your driver should carry a dead deer in their truck just in case, but an animal strike will be non-preventable. And a suicide will be considered non-preventable. Problem here is that the final rule required you to submit a police report with the data queue. In many states, including Pennsylvania, suicides involving vehicles are not considered traffic accidents. You don't get a traffic report from them. They're treated as a criminal matter, and we can't get the criminal reports. Hopefully, in terms of the data queues, when you submit them, there should be a request, and I would hope the data queue people can reach out, law enforcement to those who have investigated so they can confirm it, rather than just dismissing it for lack of a police report, as the regulation says. Side note on that. And what the FMCSA describes as an unusual type of accident, just like the Supreme Court said with pornography, I guess they'll know it when they see it. But the FMCSA classified an unusual type of accident. The example they gave is if your truck is hit by an airplane, something along those lines. How do you do it? Submit it with a data queue. What do you need? You're going to need the information, including a police report. The other thing is take as many photos, like in any situation with an accident. Make sure you document it. That's the end of the bonus situation. That's the end of what we have now. Brandon, any questions?
We do have a couple of questions that have come through in the chat. Let's see here. Dwayne Balmer asks, with the short haul exemption driver, can I use that driver to stay out overnight once a week? And if so, how do I document that event? Is there a limited number of times per month I can allow this driver to stay out?
The key thing is going to be the going out and returning to the same location for the short haul. What you're going to need to do is to look at other potential exceptions or other bases in order to do that. The only other thought is I'd have to take a look at it, but it may come under the requirements of being beyond your 150 air miles on that.
All right. We also have a question from Jay Ritter. It says, can the effective date of September 29th, 2020 for these hours of service changes be delayed by the $500 billion infrastructure
The short answer is that they can. If it's written in congressional law and the law imposes it. For example, you recall that how things were done with the 34-hour restart. But for right now, this is what we got.
Excellent. Robin Rivera asks, how in the world can being on a cell phone not count as a preventable crash?
It absolutely does. My perhaps say skepticism is that the way it's stated is that the other person has to admit that they were inattentive. Now, if it is proven, if you got the police report, they've got documentation, they've looked at the phone, they see the text, they see the phone call, I think that takes you there. I would hope it does with the data queue people. But if they're going to require a confession, that's going to be a tough road to hoe.
Sure. All right. It looks like John Casey has asked, if we don't travel 172 air miles, can we eliminate ELDs?
Yes, as long as you meet the hours requirements, hours limitations within that range, and stay within the provisions of it and not have to go over or cross over in terms of the times that you have. But stay within the air miles, stay within the hours.
All right. Those were all of the questions that had popped up in our question and answer button at the bottom of your screen or in the chat button. Looks like we're going to get a few more. If you do have a question, there should be some buttons along the bottom of your screen. For those of you that are using your computer, you can mouse over the bottom and there should be a couple of options down there. Dale Knox has just asked, can you use yard move for 30-minute break? I'm not sure that I understand the question, Dale, but maybe Doug does more than I do.
Yeah, as long any time, Dale, that does not have to be entered as driving time can be used for the 30-minute break. So that if that yard move is required to be listed as driving time, that would not qualify. But if you are off duty, if you are on duty not driving, or has sleeper berth time, or a combination of any of those for 30 minutes, that would qualify. But if the yard move has to be listed as driving time, then it cannot.
Okay, thank you, Doug, for that. Don't have any other questions. We'll take a last call. Here we go. Karina Turner asks, with the new rule for 30-minute breaks, do the drivers need to note or remark that a particular time is break time?
I think it's a good practice to do it, to put the notation on there to to show that this is the time that they're designating as their break time. It would be easy enough to show or figure out after the fact, but I think the more explicitly you document it and show it on the face, the easier it is to be identified, particularly by enforcement. It just makes everyone's job easier and saves the hassle or in case there's an issue later on.
Excellent. Pat Kane has asked, does the 8-hour driving period reset when a driver changes duty status?
Assuming you mean for the break, if that's what you're referring to, Pat, what's going to reset is if you get your 30-minute break, as a result of changing duty status, and you've changed it for 30 minutes from driving, then you're going to get another up to 8 hours of driving time. So that if I start out, I've got 3 hours of driving in, I take my 30-minute break, I can go another 8 hours of driving to complete my driving time that day.
Okay, we have an anonymous question here. If you are working within the 150 air mile radius and so are not using ELDs, and there is one day that a driver needs to stay out overnight, does that fall under the 8 days allowed in a month?
Short answer is I don't know offhand, but I know the emphasis from the FMCSA has been that they are looking at, for the short haul exemption, the driver report to and come back to the same location at all times.
Okay, we have a two-part question here from Dwayne Balmer. With the split sleeper berth provision, if a driver takes 7 hours off and then drives a 2, then takes his remaining 3 hours, that will reset the clock, correct?
If the driver has 7 hours in the sleeper berth and then takes 2 or more hours off duty, so he totals 10, that will reset your time. That will account for your 10 hours off duty.
And his second question there is, does the driver have a fresh 14 hours after that second rest period?
Yes, if they've gotten the 10 hours in total, then they would have, they're ready to drive 11 and 14. 14-hour workday, 11-hour driving.
Very good. Okay, a question here from Greg Fasalt. Given this change to CDL short haul, is there any difference between CDL and non-CDL short haul?
There's some, but for the most part, they've tried to align the two together as much as they could.
Okay, here's another question from Steve. Is there a rule a driver needs to follow to allow him to switch from over and road driver using ELD to local driver and then back to over road with ELD?
There is, and what you're going to have to do is look at how many times per month you're doing that within your last 30 days, within the 8 days, within the 30 of keeping those. You're going to have to keep within the provisions of each one to qualify, have the documentation as such. So it's going to be something that's going to have to be very delicately handled in order to do that.
Okay. We have a question here from Gladys Knox. If a driver fuels under on duty, not driving, then moves the truck to a parking space to finish his 30 minutes for break, can this be yard move or personal conveyance to move the truck, keeping this time offline 3 driving?
Well, I don't see where it's going to be, and again, there's a lot of other factors there, but I'm hard pressed to see where it's personal conveyance. There is indications in the rule in terms of fueling being potentially using that as a 30-minute break. So that's probably the best I could say in there. The problem's going to be is if your electronic log kicks it up to the driving line as soon as they start to move it, or they drive it, if you have the speed set on it, then that's going to show, absent, I would think, an annotation, depending on your log, that your driver was driving, and that's going to be problematic on it. But in the general concept has been, as long as the truck's not being moved or operated, other than driving, anything else accommodates or equates to that.
Okay, very good. I don't see any open questions.
Any other questions people have, Brandon, shoot me an email. And whomever had the question about the staying out overnight, if they want to shoot me an email, I'll see what I can find out for them and shoot that back to them.
Very good. Also, for those of you who might have joined late, we have been recording this webinar. If you would like to email me, be happy to orchestrate a way we can get you a copy of the video or perhaps a copy of Doug's slides. Does look like that is the end of our questions. I'd just like to thank all of you for participating, and especially thank Mr. Marcello for his time this morning and all of that great information. I would encourage all of you to stay tuned on our website and our social media channels, and check your emails regularly, as we will be scheduling more of these webinars in the future. All right, Doug, if there's anything else, I'd just like to say thanks. And
Oh,
we
my pleasure,
will,
Brandon. Thank you very much. And also just a quick plug and download the app for people out there.
absolutely download the PMTA app. You can find that on the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, whichever phone you may have. Oh, my email address is my first initial B and then my last name, Moree, Moree, at pmta.org. I'm just going to put that in the chat real quick. We had a question asking for my email address. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, thank
Thanks,
you
guys.
all very much and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.